Hi, and welcome to the Pathways to Stillness podcast series. I'm Dr. Gary Irwin-Kenyon. I'm a gerontologist and a Tai Chi teacher. I decided to create this series after receiving many heartfelt responses to my book, Pathways to Stillness, Reflect, Release, Renew, which is available on Amazon, Indigo, and Friesen Press, and in audiobook form from Audible and iTunes. You're also invited to check out my website at pathwaystostillness.org. As with my book, this podcast invites you to a conversation about how it's possible to discover your own pathways to meaning, peace, and stillness, even during these times of heightened anxiety, confusion, and rapid change. We are helped on our own journey to stillness by listening to the wisdom in each other's stories. Chapter 6 in my book is titled Finding Your Way. It gives you guidelines for your exploration, as well as examples of those who have discovered meaning and stillness in their lives. In this series of episodes, I have the great pleasure to speak with two close colleagues and friends, Dr. Albert Banerjee, who's our guest, and Dr. Bill Randall, who will act as co-host today. Albert is Chair of Community Health and Aging and a professor in the Gerontology Department at St. Thomas University in Fredericton. Bill is, I understand, soon to be appointed Professor Emeritus after a long and distinguished career in gerontology at St. Thomas University. Bill has just published a very interesting new book entitled Fairy Tale Wisdom, Stories for the Second Half of Life. In this episode, we are in conversation with Albert about death-friendly communities, which is a research project that Albert's been involved with. And it's very interesting in the sense, well, for many reasons, but in the sense that this death-friendly community argues that we need to consciously look at our mortality when we're designing our communities and our interactions with people, as opposed to denying death, which is still a very common view in our culture.
Yeah, just a question in conjunction with what your comments, Albert, about, from the get-go, you've had questions, slow questions about death, how we think about death, how we incorporate death into our understanding of health and life and so forth. I know that one of the projects you've been involved in and you have written about is what you call death-friendly communities.
Right.
And I wondered, in view of, your role as research professor of community health and aging, if you had some thoughts on that at some point, not necessarily right now, but that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I would. I've done that work with Julie Brasilato from the University of Lethbridge. And basically the question we're asking, we talk about age-friendly communities as ways of thinking about how we can ensure that our communities are inclusive for people as they grow older. But that tends not to include grief or mortality or death. So we believe that there is a lot to be gained by thinking about death and grief and mortality as part of that package. And one of the interesting things, I actually tend to use the word mortality rather than death, because death we tend to think of having to do with the end of life. But mortality is very different. It's about a state of being where we are mortal, which means we live with conditions of finitude. We live with impermanence of relationships, of friendships, of jobs, and of course of our own lives. And I think the notion of mortality helps remind us of that. And one of the things, I think the biggest lessons in terms of my journey in this area was spending time in hospice and palliative care, which I did, again, rather young. And what I found there was that healthcare was organized around connection and love, right? Supporting families, supporting the person who was dying to carve out some meaning in this last stage of life. And so it was organized around meaning, around love, around connection. And I left with this question of why are we waiting until we die to organize healthcare around love? So that, I would say, has been my central research question. And I think once we accept mortality, Julia and I have really found this, in our conversations about mortality, we end up talking about life and love and meaning. It connects us to, the erotic, to eros, which is, I think, better understood broadly, not in just the specific sense of sex and sexuality, but in terms of life force, in terms of Gary, you have this wonderful term in one of your chapters on Tai Chi, the journey to life. And once you can accept impermanence and mortality, it brings us closer to life, to both the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think the notion of me, this conversation could go in a whole lot of different directions, but the whole concept of meaning is often left out of the equation, and I think that's where the narrative gerontology or narrative care approach really can benefit this whole area.
Yes,
because that perspective assumes that stories are very important to us, and stories that are important to us are what's meaningful to us.
Mm-hmm.
That's the story we live by, as Bill would say.
Yeah.
So trying to get that, I remember even as a graduate student in psychology, trying to get the notion of meaning to be discussed was quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It was more instrumental and functional and scales and so on. And I was told by a couple of faculty people that, well, you can't measure meaning. You just can't measure meaning. So, okay, but it's still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
But of course, as a graduate student, you can't say too much,
Yeah.
And probably a similar thing, even more so for the notion of love,
Mm-hmm.
Love and compassion becoming what should be the basic assumption of our whole system, really.
Yeah.
But there we are at the moment. That's
Yeah.
where it is.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One thing is I think the work that you, Gary, and Bill have done in gerontology and distinguishing, for instance, what you call the outside of aging, the focus on the biological changes, the physical changes, what people might see, the white hair, the wrinkles, all of that, distinguishing that from what you call the inside of aging, where meaning lives, where experience lives, where the lessons we learn about life are. I think that is so fundamental because it gives us a different way of thinking about growing older. We can start to pay attention to all the things we learn, the wisdom we accrue, the heartache and joys. And it provides a very different way of thinking about aging. So I found that really so important in creating a space for understanding what it means to be human as we grow older. And in terms of the measurement thing, I agree. As an undergraduate and a graduate student, I felt that these questions were maybe silly and I should keep them to myself. Now I know they're fundamental, and having spent time in, say, Stockholm and with feminist care theorists, this idea, for instance, as you say, of measurement, I think one of the directors of CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health, something or other information, is noted for saying that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Someone like that has no business managing a nursing home because they do not understand what it means to be human.
Albert, if I could jump in there, one of the books that many people are aware of nowadays and seemed to make quite a stir when it first came out, is Atul Gawande's book on being mortal, which would suggest that even in the heart of the healthcare community, there is an openness to a broader perspective, in line with the perspective that you and your colleagues are wanting to flesh out. Do you want to say more about not specifically Atul Gawande's notion of mortality, but where you see yourself and your vision and your work fitting into that movement that's also happening, if I can call it a movement?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think we could probably call it a movement, and I think physicians have played a really important role. I was noticing in my aging and health class how many physicians work in interviews I actually draw upon. I mean, many of them are deeply aware of the human dimensions of suffering and the limits of biomedical approaches, even though that might be their dominant training. They're also human beings who can see what's going on and understand the limits of this model. And Gawande's book is really important in beginning to remind us of the need for this shift to start to talk about mortality and what matters to us, and recognize that it cannot be solved biomedically. We need to solve it in other ways.
And how would you, if you had the opportunity to amend the curricula of, shall we say, medical schools and nursing schools and other institutions that prepare healthcare professionals, what would you want to see in terms of courses or experiential learning, etc.?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things I do in my own course on aging and health is I start with death, and I start with loss. And I make sure that we recognize that we're all going to die and we're going to lose everything we love. And those are the rules of the game. So you have to understand health within that framework. So this idea of heroic medicine or denying death and loss, it starts to sound a little ridiculous. So we place health within that context. So that is one of the changes I would make. The other thing, of course, is get rid of the drug money that is rife within medical training and medical research, and start to make sure that we are funding medical research publicly and creating more of a buffer between the influence of drug companies, which like to sell heroic narratives, right? That's part of their instruments of profit, right? And they're not interested in our health. So, the work of Canadian physicians like Joel Lexton or John Sloan, I think, are really important in that regard.
Thank you for listening to the Pathways to Stillness podcast series. My book, Pathways to Stillness, Reflect, Release, Renew, is available on Amazon, Indigo Chapters, and Friesen Press. It is also available in audiobook form from Audible, Amazon, and iTunes.